On September 3rd, I checked into a hospital, but not just any hospital. This one, the Anderson Clinic, was infamous for its unsettling reputation, though I didn't know it at the time. I was there for an overnight observation due to my worsening seizures. My boyfriend, Jake, decided to stay with me for support. We didn't think much of the hospital's eerie appearance when we arrived. After all, who really believes in ghost stories, right? The first night seemed ordinary enough. I was too tired to notice much, and Jake just scrolled through his phone in the corner chair. It wasn't until the next morning that he told me something strange had happened. "The lights were flickering last night," he said, his voice low. "And I felt these cold spots, like someone left a window open, but there wasn't one." I rolled my eyes at him, chalking it up to old wiring and his overactive imagination. Later that morning, we casually mentioned it to our nurse, a cheerful woman named Rachel. Her smile faltered for just a second before she said, "You're in room 237, right?" We nodded. She hesitated, then added, That room has a bit of a reputation." When we pressed her for details, she admitted the hospital used to be an asylum decades ago. Our room? It belonged to a particularly notorious patient, a maniac who had brutally attacked several people before dying mysteriously in that very room. "Do you want to change rooms?" Rachel asked, her voice tinged with unease. Jake and I exchanged glances. We both laughed it off, assuming she was trying to scare us. "We'll be fine," I said with more confidence than I felt. That night, the atmosphere shifted. I woke up to a faint hum, like static, filling the room. The lights flickered again, more erratic this time. Jake sat upright in his chair, his eyes darting around. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, my pulse quickening. A shadow darted across the room, but when I turned, there was nothing there. The next few nights were a blur of terror. I'd wake up at odd hours, drenched in sweat, only to see a black mist swirling near the ceiling. The air grew colder, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something metallic. Jake grew increasingly agitated, muttering about how he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. On the fourth night, I'd had enough. The black smoke had taken shape, almost humanoid, and I could swear it was whispering my name. Jake refused to stay another minute. We called Rachel, who quickly arranged for us to move to another wing of the hospital. "You should have asked to switch earlier," she said, her face pale as she helped us gather our things. Even after leaving that cursed room, the memories haunted me. I can still feel the icy grip of that entity, its malevolent presence lingering in my mind. Next week, I'm scheduled for another hospital stay. But one thing is certain, I'll make damn sure it's not at Anderson Clinic. After the move to the new room, Jake and I finally felt some semblance of relief. The oppressive atmosphere of room 237 was behind us, and for the first time in days, I thought I might actually get some rest. But as the hours ticked by, I realized the darkness from that room wasn't quite finished with me. At 3:14 a.m., I woke with a start, drenched in cold sweat. The room was eerily silent, no faint hum from the air conditioning, no distant beeping of monitors. Just silence. Jake was snoring softly beside me, oblivious to the thick, stifling air that seemed to settle around me. My eyes were drawn to the corner of the room, where a shadow loomed darker than the rest. It pulsed and shifted as if alive, and though I knew I should have looked away, I couldn't. Suddenly, the shadow moved. It stretched, elongating until it reached the foot of my bed. A low, guttural voice filled the air, speaking words I couldn't understand but that made my blood run cold. I wanted to scream, to wake Jake, but I was frozen. Paralyzed. The figure leaned in closer, and though it had no face, I felt its eyes bore into mine. "Leave!" it growled. Then it vanished. The next morning, I told Jake what had happened. His face paled, and he admitted something he'd been hiding from me. I saw it too. The first night we were here. I thought I was just imagining things, but now, His voice trailed off, and we sat in tense silence, the weight of our shared experiences sinking in. Determined to find answers, I decided to do some digging. Rachel wasn't on shift that day, so I turned to one of the other nurses, an older man named Greg. He seemed reluctant to talk at first but eventually relented. "This hospital, it's seen things. Bad things. Room 237? That's just the tip of the iceberg. People say there are spirits here, angry, restless ones. They don't like visitors. What happened to the man in 237? I pressed. Greg's expression darkened. He wasn't just a murderer. He was something worse. They say he used to perform rituals, try to summon things. One night, he attacked a nurse, screaming that he'd made a pact and they were coming for him. The next morning, they found him dead. No wounds, no signs of struggle. Just dead. Like his soul had been ripped out. That night, I couldn't shake Greg's words. Rituals. Pacts. The strange occurrences in the room began to make a twisted sort of sense. And then it hit me. I hadn't left that room unscathed. Something had followed me. The realization struck me like a freight train. Whatever malevolent force resided in room 237 had attached itself to me, and there was no escaping it. Jake and I tried to pretend everything was normal, but the signs were impossible to ignore. Shadows flickered in the corners of my vision, whispers echoed in empty hallways, and every night the air around me seemed to grow colder. On the second night in the new room, Jake woke me with a panicked shout. "It's here!" he cried, pointing toward the corner of the room. I bolted upright, my heart pounding, and saw it, a dark, undulating mass. This time, it didn't stay in the shadows. The figure stepped forward, its form becoming more distinct. It was a man, or what was left of one. His eyes were empty voids, and his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. "Why did you leave?" the thing rasped, its voice a guttural snarl. Jake grabbed my arm, pulling me closer to him as if he could shield me from whatever this was. The figure didn't move closer, but the weight of its presence pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. Just as suddenly as it appeared, it dissolved into the darkness, leaving us trembling in its wake. The next day, I confronted Rachel as soon as she arrived for her shift. I told her everything we'd experienced, my voice cracking under the weight of my fear. "You have to help me," I pleaded. "This thing won't leave me alone." Rachel's face was pale, and she exchanged a worried glance with Greg, who happened to be nearby. "There might be a way to sever the connection," she said hesitantly. "But it's risky." "I'll do anything," I insisted, desperation creeping into my voice. Rachel led me to a small, dimly lit room in the basement of the hospital. The air down there was thick and heavy, carrying an almost tangible sense of dread. Greg joined us, carrying a small wooden box that rattled ominously with every step. "This used to be part of the asylum," Rachel explained. "The rituals he performed, they started here." Inside the box were several strange items: black candles, a rusty dagger, and a bundle of herbs that smelled acrid and bitter. "This will bind it," Greg said, though his voice betrayed his uncertainty. "If you're strong enough." As they began the ritual, the temperature in the room plummeted. The flickering candlelight cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, and a low, guttural growl echoed through the space. The entity was here, furious and unwilling to let me go. The pressure in the room was unbearable, like 1,000 hands pushing against my body. "Hold on," Rachel shouted as she chanted in a language I couldn't understand. The black smoke began to swirl around me, its icy tendrils clawing at my skin. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the roar of the entity's rage. "It's almost done!" Greg yelled, gripping the dagger tightly. With one swift motion, he plunged it into the center of the circle they'd drawn on the floor. The smoke recoiled, a piercing shriek filling the room as the entity was pulled into the void. Then silence. I collapsed to the floor, shaking and gasping for air. The oppressive weight was gone, but the memory of its presence lingered like a stain on my soul. Rachel helped me to my feet, her hands trembling as much as mine. "It's over," she whispered, though none of us truly believed it. Jake and I left the hospital the next day, vowing never to return. But deep down, I knew the darkness wasn't gone. It had been quieted, perhaps even banished for now, but something that powerful doesn't disappear so easily. And every so often, in the still of the night, I feel a cold breath on the back of my neck and hear a faint, rasping whisper. I'm still here. Life after the hospital felt like walking on a razor's edge, every step filled with trepidation. Jake and I tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, but the shadows of what we'd endured loomed large over our lives. The nights were the worst. Even with every light in the apartment turned on, the oppressive darkness found its way into the corners of my mind. A week passed before the dreams started. They weren't just dreams, though. They were vivid, visceral nightmares that left me drenched in sweat and gasping for air. In them, I was back in room 237. The walls pulsed with a sickly, unnatural light, and the shadowy figure loomed over me, its eyeless gaze boring into my soul. Each time, it whispered the same chilling phrase. "You can't run." I confided in Jake, but his patience was wearing thin. "It's over," he insisted one morning after I'd woken him with my screaming. "We did the ritual. It's gone. You've got to let it go." But I couldn't. Deep down, I knew the entity wasn't gone. It was waiting, biding its time, feeding off my fear. I began to notice small things around the apartment. Objects moved from where I'd left them, cold drafts that couldn't be explained, and the ever-present feeling of being watched. One night, as I stood in the kitchen pouring myself a glass of water, the lights flickered. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The temperature dropped sharply, and my breath came out in visible puffs. Slowly, I turned around. There it was. The shadowy figure from the hospital stood in the doorway, its grin wider and more grotesque than ever. "I warned you," it hissed, its voice a cacophony of anger and malice. My scream caught in my throat as it lunged at me, its form dissolving into black smoke that enveloped me in a suffocating embrace. I blacked out. When I came to, Jake was shaking me awake, his face a mask of fear. "What happened?" he demanded, but I couldn't bring myself to tell him. How could I explain that the entity was stronger now, more determined than ever to claim me? Desperation drove me to seek out Rachel and Greg again. They were hesitant to get involved, but when they saw the state I was in, they reluctantly agreed to help. "This isn't just a haunting," Rachel said grimly. "It's a possession. If we don't act fast, it'll consume you entirely." We returned to the hospital's basement, where the air was heavier than before, thick with a malevolent energy that made my skin crawl. Rachel and Greg set up a new ritual, more elaborate and dangerous than the last. This time, I would be the focal point. As the ritual began, the entity made its presence known. The room shook violently, and the candle's flames burned black. The shadowy figure materialized in the center of the circle, its form writhing and shifting. "You're mine!" it roared, its voice echoing with unearthly power. Rachel and Greg chanted furiously, their voices rising above the chaos. The entity fought back, lashing out with tendrils of darkness that sent Greg sprawling to the floor. I could feel it inside me, clawing at my mind, trying to take control. Summoning every ounce of willpower, I screamed, "You don't own me!" The room exploded with light, and the entity let out a final, ear-piercing shriek as it was pulled into the void. The silence that followed was deafening. I collapsed, utterly spent, but for the first time in weeks, I felt truly free. Jake and I moved far away from the city, leaving the hospital and its horrors behind. Though the nightmares have faded, I'll never forget the terror I endured. The scars it left on my soul are a constant reminder of the darkness that exists in this world, and the strength it takes to confront it. Even now, I sometimes catch a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye or hear a faint whisper in the dead of night. I tell myself it's just my imagination, but deep down, I know the truth: some shadows never truly leave.